Picture this. It is 1994, and a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt is walking across a barren, wind-scoured hilltop in southeastern Turkey, a desolate place where the summer heat shimmers off the limestone bedrock, and the locals have, for generations, called this unremarkable mound Göbekli Tepe, Potbelly Hill, because of the gentle, rounded slope that seeps from the Harran Plain like the belly of some ancient, sleeping giant. Farmers have been working this land for centuries, cursing under their breath each time their plows strike yet another carved stone buried just beneath the surface. And for just as long they have been dragging these strange, T-shaped rocks to the edges of their fields and tossing them aside like so much worthless rubble, never once suspecting that they were discarding pieces of the oldest temple complex ever built by human hands. Schmidt, however, is not a farmer, and when he kneels in the dust to examine one of these dismissed fragments, when he traces the outline of a fox carved in relief across its weathered surface, something in his trained mind begins to whisper that this hilltop is not what it appears to be, that beneath his feet lies something so old, so impossible, so fundamentally at odds with everything archaeologists believed about human prehistory, that its discovery will force an entire discipline to question whether they ever truly understood where civilization came from in the first place. What Klaus Schmidt found at Göbekli Tepe was nothing less than a rupture in the timeline of human history, a monument that should not exist, built by people who should not have been capable of building it, during an era when humanity was supposed to be struggling merely to survive the final, brutal centuries of the last ice age. We are talking about structures dating to approximately 9600 BCE, a date so staggeringly ancient that it predates the Egyptian pyramids by more than 7,000 years, predates Stonehenge by 6,000 years, predates the invention of writing, the wheel, pottery, and metallurgy, and predates even the earliest evidence of organized agriculture in the region by at least 1,000 years. According to everything that archaeologists had spent the previous century carefully establishing about the development of human societies, the people alive during this period should have been small, scattered bands of hunter-gatherers following migrating herds across frozen landscapes, their entire existence consumed by the daily struggle to find food, shelter, and safety from predators, leaving them neither the time, the resources, nor the social organization necessary to undertake massive construction projects requiring hundreds of workers, sophisticated engineering knowledge, and, perhaps most importantly, a shared religious or ideological vision powerful enough to unite disparate groups in a common, monumentally ambitious purpose. And yet here it stands, sprawling across a 20-acre site that includes at least 20 circular enclosures, each containing rings of towering, T-shaped limestone pillars that reach heights of nearly 18 feet and weigh as much as 50 tons apiece. Pillars that had to be quarried from the bedrock of the surrounding plateau, using nothing but stone tools and flint blades, then somehow transported uphill, then carefully erected in precise geometric arrangements that modern architects have only recently begun to fully appreciate for their mathematical sophistication. The logistics alone are staggering to contemplate. Estimates based on experimental archaeology suggest that carving a single pillar would have required a team of skilled workers laboring for an entire year, while transporting that pillar to the construction site would have demanded the coordinated effort of at least 50 to 75 people working continuously for a week. And these estimates assume ideal conditions, adequate nutrition, and a level of social organization capable of feeding, housing, and directing a workforce numbering in the hundreds. Klaus Schmidt himself calculated that the construction of Göbekli Tepe would have required hundreds of people working together over extended periods, a workforce that could only have been assembled and maintained by what he described as a small religious elite, capable of either coercing or enticing nomadic populations to participate in a building project that offered no immediate practical benefit: no shelter, no stored food, no protection from enemies. Only the intangible reward of serving something larger than themselves, something sacred, something eternal, carved in stone. The implications of this discovery were so profound, so fundamentally destabilizing to the established narrative of human development, that when Schmidt first presented his findings to the academic community, many of his colleagues simply refused to believe him, insisting that the radiocarbon dates must be wrong, that the site must have been built later and then artificially aged by some quirk of geology, that hunter-gatherers could not possibly have achieved what Schmidt was claiming they achieved because the textbooks said it was impossible, and the textbooks were written by serious scholars who had spent their careers establishing the sequence of human progress with painstaking care. The traditional timeline, after all, made perfect sense. First came agriculture, which allowed people to settle in one place instead of constantly moving. Settlement created food surpluses, which freed some members of the community from the daily necessity of finding their next meal. Those freed individuals became specialists, artisans, priests, administrators, builders, whose skills could be devoted to projects beyond mere survival. And only then, only after this complex chain of developments had unfolded over many generations, could anything like organized religion, monumental architecture, or sophisticated, symbolic systems possibly emerge. This was the Neolithic revolution as it had been understood for decades. Farming led to villages, villages led to cities, cities led to civilization, and civilization, with its temples and monuments and systems of meaning, was the final flowering of a long, slow process that began with the first planted seed. But Göbekli Tepe makes a mockery of this tidy progression, because here was a temple complex of breathtaking ambition and sophistication, built 1,000 years before anyone in the region had figured out how to domesticate a single plant or animal, built by people who were still hunting wild gazelle and gathering wild grains, built on a remote mountaintop that offered no agricultural potential whatsoever, built for reasons that had nothing to do with practical survival and everything to do with beliefs, rituals, and a cosmological vision so compelling that it could motivate enormous collective sacrifice without any promise of material reward. As archaeologists Klaus Schmidt and Ian Hodder eventually admitted with a mixture of wonder and professional discomfort, Göbekli Tepe suggested that all our theories are wrong, that the conventional sequence of development might actually be reversed, that perhaps humans did not create religion because they had finally achieved the leisure and stability of agricultural life, but rather that humans created agriculture because their religious impulses demanded permanent gathering places, monumental expressions of faith, and communities large enough to build temples worthy of their gods. And what gods they must have worshipped, what strange and terrifying powers they must have sought to propitiate, because the pillars of Göbekli Tepe are not merely architectural achievements. They are canvases for an elaborate symbolic language that covers nearly every surface with images of creatures that seem chosen specifically for their capacity to inspire fear, reverence, and awe carved in, both high and low relief, sometimes with astonishing naturalistic detail, and sometimes in stylized forms that suggest a symbolic rather than representational intent, the animals of Göbekli Tepe form a menagerie of predators, scavengers, and venomous creatures that would have posed genuine threats to the humans who lived among them. Lions with bared fangs frozen in expressions of eternal aggression, wild boars with bristling tusks and muscular haunches tensed as if for a charge, vultures with wingspans stretching across entire pillar faces and hooked beaks poised to tear flesh, serpents coiling and writhing in patterns that seem almost alive in flickering torchlight, scorpions with their segmented tails raised in the universal posture of threat, and spiders whose presence suggests dangers lurking in darkness, waiting to strike the unwary. These are not the animals that the builders of Göbekli Tepe hunted for food. Archaeologists have recovered vast quantities of gazelle bones from the site, indicating that these gentle, grass-eating creatures formed the primary protein source for the community. Yet gazelle images are almost entirely absent from the carved pillars, as if the artists deliberately excluded the mundane, the nutritious, the daily, in favor of creatures that occupied a different category altogether in their understanding of the world. But perhaps the most frequently depicted animal at Göbekli Tepe, and thus one assumes the most symbolically important, is the fox, a creature that appears again and again across multiple enclosures, carved onto pillars, depicted on belt buckles, shown as a pelt hanging from the waist of an anthropomorphic figure, and found in skeletal form throughout the site in quantities that far exceed what dietary necessity could explain. The fox was clearly not a primary food source, yet fox bones appear at Göbekli Tepe in numbers rivaling sheep and goat remains. The fox was not a large or dangerous predator worthy of fear, yet its image occupies positions of obvious prominence in the iconographic program. The fox was, in short, something else entirely, a creature of symbolic importance whose meaning has been lost to the millennia, but whose persistent presence hints at mythological narratives, totemic affiliations, or cosmological beliefs that the builders of Göbekli Tepe considered essential to preserve in stone for future generations to contemplate. And here is where the mystery deepens into something that borders on the unsettling. Because when you ask modern archaeologists what these symbols mean, what the foxes represent, what message the vultures were meant to convey, what cosmological drama is being enacted across these 12,000-year-old surfaces, the answer you receive is almost invariably some variation of, "We don't know." This is not false modesty, nor is it intellectual laziness. The honest truth is that without written records, without a Rosetta Stone that bridges the symbolic, and the linguistic without any surviving oral traditions that connect us to the beliefs of these long-vanished people, definitive interpretation remains impossible. And serious scholars are reluctant to speculate beyond what the evidence can support. But "we don't know" is also a strangely passive stance to take toward one of the most elaborate and carefully maintained symbolic systems ever created by prehistoric humans, a system that remained consistent across at least 1,500 years of continuous use, suggesting that whatever these symbols meant, their meaning was important enough to preserve unchanged across 75 generations of builders, artists, and worshippers who clearly understood something that we, with all our technology and training, cannot seem to grasp. Some researchers have begun to suspect that this interpretive paralysis is not merely the result of insufficient evidence, but reflects a deeper reluctance within the archaeological establishment to engage seriously with possibilities that might overturn comfortable assumptions about human prehistory. Because if the builders of Göbekli Tepe possessed sophisticated astronomical knowledge, as some have proposed, if their symbols encode observations about celestial events, seasonal cycles, or cosmic catastrophes, if their monument was designed not merely as a place of worship, but as a record, a message intended to survive the collapse of their civilization and communicate something essential to whoever might eventually dig it up. Then we are dealing with capabilities, intentions, and levels of organization that simply do not fit the narrative of slow, gradual development from primitive hunter-gatherer to sophisticated city dweller that has dominated archaeological thinking for over a century. Perhaps the deepest mystery of Göbekli Tepe is not what was built, but why it was destroyed, or rather, why it was buried deliberately and systematically beneath thousands of tons of rubble, animal bones, and broken tools sometime around 8000 BCE. As if the people who had maintained this sacred site for nearly 2 millennia suddenly decided that it needed not just to be abandoned, but to be hidden, sealed away from the world in a manner so thorough that it would remain undiscovered until a curious German archaeologist knelt in the Turkish dust 11,000 years later and wondered what those carved stones might mean. But to understand why Göbekli Tepe was buried, we must first understand what its builders were trying to say. And nowhere is that message more concentrated, more mysterious, or more hotly debated than on a single pillar in Enclosure D, a carved monolith that researchers have come to call the Vulture Stone, which some believe contains nothing less than a date stamp for the end of the world, a record of cosmic catastrophe carved in limestone by people who survived an extinction-level event and wanted to make sure that no one, ever, would be allowed to forget what the sky had done to the earth. Deep within the circular confines of Enclosure D, standing among a ring of 11 towering megaliths that have kept their silent vigil for nearly 12,000 years, there rises a pillar that has generated more controversy, more heated academic debate, and more wildly divergent interpretations than perhaps any other single artifact from the ancient world. A carved limestone monolith designated by archaeologists with the clinical name Pillar 43, but known to the wider world by a far more evocative title, the Vulture Stone. To stand before this pillar, as only a handful of researchers and carefully supervised visitors have been permitted to do, is to confront a surface so densely packed with imagery, so layered with symbols whose meanings seem to shimmer just beyond the edge of comprehension, that the experience has been compared by those who have had it to reading a page from a book written in a language that feels hauntingly familiar yet remains stubbornly, maddeningly untranslatable, as if the ancient artists who carved these images were trying desperately to communicate something of profound importance across the vast gulf of millennia. And we, their distant descendants, have somehow lost the key that would unlock their urgent message. The imagery begins at the top of the pillar, where 3 distinctive shapes march in a horizontal row across the stone. Shapes that look, to modern eyes accustomed to the mundane objects of contemporary life, uncannily like handbags, with their rectangular bases and curved handles positioned above them, in a configuration so reminiscent of a fashion accessory that it would be almost comical if it weren't so deeply strange. This echo of something familiar carved into rock, older than the concept of civilization itself. Below these enigmatic containers, if that is indeed what they are, the scene unfolds into a tableau of creatures that seems designed to unsettle, to disturb, to communicate something about the relationship between life and death, that the modern mind, insulated by centuries of rationalism and technological mastery over nature, can barely begin to fathom. A massive vulture dominates the central portion of the composition, its wings spread wide in a gesture that might be protective or predatory depending on the angle from which you view it, its curved beak unmistakably that of a carrion bird, a creature that survives by consuming the dead and positioned near the tip of its right wing, almost as if the bird is presenting it, offering it, or perhaps catching it in mid-flight. There hovers a perfect circle, a disk whose identity has become the subject of fierce, scholarly disagreement that shows no signs of resolution. Below the vulture, a scorpion crouches with its segmented tail raised in the universal posture of threat, its pincers extended toward some unseen enemy, or perhaps toward the viewer, toward you, across 11,500 Tarndats. Years of human history, as if the danger it represents has not diminished with the passage of time, but merely waited, patient and venomous, for someone to finally understand what it was placed there to signify. Other creatures populate the margins of the scene. Birds that might be ibises or young vultures. Serpents whose coiling forms have been interpreted as representing everything from rivers to constellations to the primal chaos that existed before creation. And scattered among these figures are abstract symbols, the H-shapes and nested V-marks that appear throughout Göbekli Tepe, but whose meanings remain, according to official archaeological consensus, essentially unknown. And then, at the very bottom of this extraordinary composition, positioned beneath the scorpion as if crushed by the weight of all the cosmic imagery above it, there appears the most disturbing figure of all, a human being, clearly male based on anatomical details that the ancient artists rendered with surprising explicitness, but a human being without a head, a decapitated figure whose neck terminates in nothing, whose identity has been literally erased by the removal of the feature that most defines our individuality, and whose body displays, and here the archaeological literature tends to employ delicate euphemisms, clear evidence of sexual arousal, an erection carved in stone that has persisted for 12 millennia as a testament to something the builders of Göbekli Tepe considered important enough to preserve forever in their most sacred iconographic space. The mainstream archaeological interpretation of this bewildering assemblage of images can be summarized with a single phrase that has become something of a mantra among researchers who study Göbekli Tepe. We believe it is symbolic, but we cannot determine the specific meaning. This is not evasion, nor is it intellectual cowardice. It is the honest acknowledgement that without written texts, without oral traditions that survive from this period, without any Rosetta Stone that might bridge the gap between their symbols and our language, definitive interpretation remains impossible, and responsible scholars are trained to resist the temptation to fill the void of uncertainty with speculation that cannot be verified. Klaus Schmidt, who spent 2 decades excavating Göbekli Tepe before his death in 2014, proposed that the vulture imagery related to excarnation practices, the deliberate exposure of corpses to carrion birds, as a means of separating flesh from bone, a ritual that has been documented at other Neolithic sites in the region and that carries profound spiritual implications about the relationship between death, transformation, and the release of the soul from its bodily prison. In Schmidt's reading, the circle above the vulture's wing was not the sun, not a comet, not an astronomical body at all, but rather a severed human head, the head that once belonged to the decapitated figure at the bottom of the pillar, now shown in the process of being carried skyward by the great psychopomp bird, the soul carrier whose role was to transport the essence of the deceased from the realm of the living to whatever afterlife the builders of Göbekli Tepe believed awaited them among the stars. This interpretation has the virtue of internal consistency, of connecting the various elements of the composition into a coherent narrative about death and spiritual transformation. And it aligns with evidence from other prehistoric sites where vulture imagery appears in clearly funerary contexts. most notably at Çatalhöyük, a settlement approximately 300 miles to the west, where painted murals depict vultures with distinctly anthropomorphic features swooping down upon headless human corpses, in scenes that leave little doubt about the ritual significance of these carrion birds in Neolithic Anatolian spirituality. But, in 2017, a chemical engineer from the University of Edinburgh named Martin Sweatman published a paper that proposed something far more dramatic, far more specific, and far more controversial than anything the mainstream archaeological community had been willing to consider. A paper that claimed the vulture stone was not merely a symbolic representation of death and rebirth, but an actual astronomical record, a date stamp carved in stone that marked the occurrence of a catastrophic cosmic event, whose effects had been felt across the entire planet, and whose memory had shaped the beliefs and practices of the Göbekli Tepe community for thousands of years afterward. Using archaeoastronomy, the discipline that studies how ancient peoples observed, understood, and represented celestial phenomena, Sweatman argued that the animals on Pillar 43 corresponded to specific constellations in the night sky, that the vulture represented the constellation Sagittarius, the scorpion represented Scorpius, and the other creatures could be mapped onto the zodiacal and near-zodiacal regions of the celestial sphere with a degree of correlation that, according to his statistical analysis, had less than a 1 in 5 million probability of occurring by chance. If Sweatman's astronomical identifications were correct, then the disk above the vulture's wing was neither a severed head nor an abstract symbol of the soul, but the sun itself, positioned at a specific point in the sky relative to the background constellations, a configuration that, when calculated using modern astronomical software capable of reconstructing the night sky as it appeared at any point in human history, corresponded to a date of approximately 10,950 BCE, give or take 250 years, due to the inherent imprecision of matching carved images to actual star positions. This date was not arbitrary, was not merely one moment among the hundreds of thousands of nights that the Göbekli Tepe community existed. It was, Sweatman argued, the date of the Younger Dryas impact event, a proposed cosmic catastrophe that has been gaining increasing support among geologists, climatologists, and planetary scientists, as the explanation for one of the most dramatic and mysterious climate shifts in the last 100,000 years of Earth's history. The Younger Dryas period, named after a cold-loving flower that suddenly reappeared in European pollen records around 10,900 BCE, was a brutal return to Ice Age conditions that lasted approximately 200 years, and that interrupted what had been, until that point, a steady warming trend as the great glaciers of the last Ice Age gradually retreated towards the poles. The onset was sudden, so sudden that it has been compared to flipping a switch, with average temperatures in the Northern Hemisphere dropping by as much as 7 degrees Celsius within a single human generation, plunging populations that had begun to adapt to warmer conditions back into a frozen world of scarcity, migration, and death. For decades, scientists struggled to explain what could have caused such an abrupt reversal, proposing everything from changes in ocean circulation patterns to volcanic eruptions to the catastrophic drainage of glacial lakes. But in recent years, a new hypothesis has gained significant traction. The idea that Earth was struck by fragments of a disintegrating comet, an impact event or series of events that threw enough debris into the atmosphere to block sunlight, trigger massive wildfires across multiple continents, and initiate a cascade of climatic effects that persisted for over a millennium. The evidence for this impact hypothesis comes from multiple independent sources that have been steadily accumulating since the early 2000s. Soil samples from North America, Europe, and the Middle East that contain anomalously high concentrations of platinum, nanodiamonds, and magnetic spherules, materials typically associated with extraterrestrial impacts. A layer of black carbon found at numerous archaeological sites dating to this period, suggesting continent-wide burning. And, most dramatically, the discovery in 2018 of the Hiawatha crater beneath the Greenland ice sheet, a 31-kilometer-wide impact structure that some researchers believe dates to precisely the period in question. If Sweatman is correct, the builders of Göbekli Tepe witnessed this catastrophe, or its immediate aftermath, and carved a record of it into stone, marking not only the date of the event through astronomical symbolism, but also its devastating consequences through the imagery of death. Scavenger birds feasting on corpses, and a world so transformed by destruction that the headless man at the bottom of the pillar might represent not a single individual undergoing ritual transformation, but humanity itself, decapitated by cosmic violence, its future severed from its past. The official response from the archaeological team at Göbekli Tepe was skeptical, measured, and ultimately dismissive, with researchers like Jens Notroff pointing out that Sweatman's analysis appeared to cherry-pick symbols that supported his thesis, while ignoring others that did not fit. Most notably, the erect phallus of the headless figure, which Notroff observed with dry academic understatement, somehow contradicts the lifeless notion of mass extinction and cosmic catastrophe, and implies a much more complex narrative behind these reliefs than a simple record of disaster. This is a fair criticism, one that highlights the genuine difficulty of interpreting imagery created by people whose symbolic vocabulary differed fundamentally from our own. And it serves as a reminder that even the most compelling theories about ancient monuments must be held tentatively, subject to revision as new evidence emerges and new interpretive frameworks are developed. And yet the dismissal of Sweatman's theory raises its own troubling questions, because if the astronomical interpretation is wrong, then what is the correct interpretation, and why? After 30 years of excavation and research, has no alternative explanation achieved anything approaching consensus among the scholars who have devoted their careers to understanding this site. The vulture carries a circle. What does the circle represent? The scorpion raises its tail. What danger does it signify? The headless man displays his arousal. What narrative connects sexuality and death in a composition that also includes carrion birds and mysterious containers that look like handbags from a department store display? To say we don't know is honest, but it is also, in a profound sense, a failure. A failure to engage seriously with the possibility that these ancient people were smarter, more observant, more capable of recording and transmitting complex information than the standard model of prehistoric development allows, and that our inability to decode their message reflects not the limitations of their symbolic system, but the limitations of our own willingness to consider explanations that fall outside the boundaries of what we have already decided is possible. Perhaps the vulture stone is exactly what Klaus Schmidt believed it to be, a representation of the soul's journey from the land of the living to the realm of the dead, carried skyward by the great psychopomp vulture, while the scorpion, guardian of the underworld in so many ancient mythologies, stands watch below, ready to consume any soul that fails to complete its passage successfully. Perhaps it is what Sweatman claims, a date stamp for the apocalypse, a record of cosmic catastrophe carved by survivors who wanted to ensure that their descendants and their descendants' descendants would never forget what the sky had done to the world. Or perhaps it is something else entirely, something that incorporates elements of both interpretations while transcending the binary choice between funerary ritual and astronomical record. A complex, multi-layered symbol system that communicated simultaneously on multiple levels to audiences who understood how to read its interlocking meanings. Meanings that we have lost because we have lost the cultural context, the oral traditions, the initiatory knowledge that would have allowed a member of the Göbekli Tepe community to look upon this pillar and understand, immediately and intuitively, what every figure represented, what story they told together, and what obligations that story placed upon those who beheld it. But the vulture stone is not the only symbol at Göbekli Tepe that seems to reach across time and space to connect with imagery found in cultures that, according to everything mainstream archaeology teaches, could have had no contact with these ancient Turkish hill dwellers. Because at the top of Pillar 43, those three strange handbag shapes sit waiting for explanation. And when you begin to trace where else in the ancient world that distinctive form appears, you find yourself confronting a pattern so widespread, so persistent across millennia and continents, that the comfortable assumption of independent invention begins to strain under the weight of coincidence, piled upon coincidence, until the question becomes not whether these symbols are connected, but how, and what that connection might mean for everything we thought we knew about the isolated development of human civilizations. There is a particular kind of discomfort that settles over academic conferences when someone raises the subject of the handbags. A visible stiffening of postures, a careful neutrality of expression, a sudden intense interest in coffee cups and conference programs, because the handbag motif at Göbekli Tepe touches upon one of the most contentious and career-threatening topics in all of archaeology: the possibility that ancient civilizations, separated by vast oceans and thousands of years, might have shared symbols, knowledge, or even direct contact in ways that the established model of independent, cultural development cannot easily accommodate. The three shapes carved at the top of Pillar 43, with their rectangular bases and curved handles arching above them like the straps of a modern purse, would be unremarkable in isolation. Ancient people made containers. Containers have handles. Similar solutions to similar problems arise independently all the time. But the handbag motif does not exist in isolation. And when you begin to trace its appearances across the ancient world, you find yourself confronting a pattern so persistent, so geographically dispersed, and so chronologically extensive that the comfortable explanation of coincidental similarity begins to feel less like scientific caution and more like willful blindness to evidence that refuses to fit the paradigm. Let us begin with what we know for certain. At Göbekli Tepe, dating to approximately 9600 BCE, the handbag shapes appear at the top of the vulture stone in a row of three, positioned above a complex tableau of cosmic and death-related imagery in what appears to be a place of symbolic prominence, as if they were meant to frame or contextualize everything depicted below them, establishing some kind of categorical framework within which the vultures, scorpions, and headless figures must be understood. These are not containers being carried by anyone. They are symbols floating in conceptual space, divorced from any practical function and elevated to the status of pure iconography, which suggests that whatever they represented to the builders of Göbekli Tepe, it was something abstract, something ideological, something that transcended the mundane utility of a vessel designed to hold and transport physical objects. 8,000 years later and 2,000 miles to the east, in the palace reliefs of ancient Assyria, dating to approximately 880–59 BCE, Winged figures that scholars have variously identified as genies, protective spirits, or divine messengers are depicted carrying objects of unmistakably similar form, small containers with rectangular bodies and curved handles that the figures grasp in one hand while performing ritual gestures with the other, often in scenes that appear to involve purification ceremonies, the blessing of sacred trees, or the protection of royal personages from malevolent supernatural forces. The Assyrian handbags have been interpreted by mainstream scholars as buckets containing holy water or perhaps pollen from the male date palm flower, implements used in agricultural fertility rituals that were central to Mesopotamian religious practice. And this interpretation makes sense within the specific cultural context of Assyrian society, where the date palm was a symbol of abundance and the rituals of pollination carried profound spiritual significance. But this explanation, however satisfying it may be for the Assyrian examples in isolation, does nothing to explain why the same distinctive shape, rectangular base, curved handle, proportions that echo with almost suspicious precision, appears in the monumental sculptures of the Olmec civilization in Mesoamerica, created between approximately 1200 and 400 BCE by people who lived on the opposite side of the planet, who had never heard of Assyria, who had never seen a date palm, and who, according to every mainstream model of human migration and cultural development, could not possibly have had any contact with either the ancient Near East or the even more ancient builders of Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey. The Olmec handbag carriers are particularly striking because they appear in contexts that seem to mirror, with uncanny precision, the religious and mythological significance attributed to similar figures in the Old World. Divine or semi-divine beings, culture heroes, civilizers who brought knowledge and wisdom to humanity from some otherworldly source, entities that occupy the boundary between the human and the supernatural, and whose role seems to be the transmission of sacred information from higher realms to the terrestrial sphere. Monument 19, from the Olmec site of La Venta, depicts a figure that later Mesoamerican cultures would recognize as an early representation of the feathered serpent deity, known to the Maya as Kukulkan and to the Aztecs as Quetzalcoatl, and this figure carries in its hand a container whose form is so similar to the Assyrian ritual buckets and the Göbekli Tepe carvings that when images from all three cultures are placed side by side, even the most committed skeptic must acknowledge that we are looking at something that demands explanation beyond the dismissive assertion that humans everywhere independently invented similar-looking bags because bags are useful and human creativity is limited. The conventional archaeological response to this apparent pattern is to invoke the principle of independent invention combined with the psychological concept of convergent design. The idea that certain shapes are so fundamental, so naturally suited to their function, so inevitably suggested by the constraints of human anatomy and the physics of carrying objects, that their repeated appearance across cultures reflects not connection, but rather the universal logic of practical problem-solving applied to universal human needs. We have hands that grasp, objects that need to be transported, materials that can be woven or carved into containers. Is it really so surprising that people everywhere would arrive at similar solutions, similar shapes, similar aesthetic choices in how they represent those solutions in their art? This argument has considerable force, and it would be intellectually dishonest to dismiss it simply because it conflicts with more romantic narratives of ancient global connection. But it also has significant limitations that its proponents are often reluctant to acknowledge. Limitations that become apparent when you examine not just the shape of the handbag motif, but the context in which it appears. the figures who carry it, and the broader symbolic programs within which it is embedded. Consider the Maori of New Zealand, an indigenous Polynesian people whose ancestors arrived on those remote Pacific islands sometime around the 13th century CE, thousands of years after Göbekli Tepe was buried, and thousands of miles from both Assyria and the Olmec heartland, yet whose mythology includes a narrative that resonates with disturbing familiarity when placed alongside the handbag imagery from these other, supposedly unconnected cultures. In Maori tradition, a deified ancestor named Tane ascended to the highest heaven, the dwelling place of the supreme god Io, and returned to earth carrying 3 baskets filled with different categories of sacred knowledge: wisdom about the natural world, wisdom about ritual and prayer, wisdom about agriculture and practical skills, which he then distributed to humanity, establishing the foundations of Maori civilization and the protocols by which that civilization would be governed and perpetuated across generations. The 3 baskets of Tane are not identical in form to the handbags of Göbekli Tepe, the buckets of Assyria, or the containers of the Olmec figures, but they occupy exactly the same conceptual position. Vessels of sacred knowledge carried from divine realms to the human world by intermediary beings whose role is to civilize, to educate, to transform humanity from a state of ignorance to a state of wisdom through the gift of transmitted information preserved in portable containers. This is where the discomfort of mainstream archaeology becomes most acute, because once you begin to notice these parallels, not just in the shape of the objects, but in the mythological function they serve, the type of beings who carry them, and the narrative of civilizing knowledge that surrounds them, it becomes increasingly difficult to maintain the position that we are looking at nothing more than coincidental similarity, arising from the universal human tendency to put things in bags. Graham Hancock, the British journalist and author whose works on alternative archaeology have sold millions of copies while earning him the permanent enmity of academic establishments around the world, has pointed to the handbag motif as evidence supporting his thesis that a technologically sophisticated civilization existed before the Younger Dryas catastrophe, and that survivors of that lost society subsequently traveled the globe, sharing their knowledge with indigenous populations and establishing the foundations for the various cradles of civilization that would emerge independently, according to mainstream chronology, in Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, China, and the Americas. The academic response to Hancock has been, to put it mildly, hostile, with archaeologists accusing him of pseudoscience, cherry-picking evidence, ignoring the vast body of scholarship that demonstrates how civilizations develop, gradually from local antecedents rather than springing fully formed from the teachings of wandering sages, and fundamentally misunderstanding how archaeological evidence is properly evaluated and interpreted. These criticisms are not without merit. Hancock is not a trained archaeologist. His methods do not conform to academic standards of rigor, and his conclusions often outrun his evidence in ways that professional scholars find exasperating at best and intellectually dishonest at worst. But the intensity of the academic reaction to Hancock also reveals something important about the sociology of knowledge production. The handbag motif represents exactly the kind of evidence that, if taken seriously, would require fundamental revisions to established paradigms. And paradigm revision is always resisted by those whose careers, reputations, and institutional positions depend upon the continued validity of existing frameworks. Laird Scranton, a researcher who has devoted decades to studying the symbolic systems of ancient cultures, has proposed an interpretation of the handbag motif that attempts to transcend the binary opposition between coincidental similarity and direct cultural transmission. arguing instead that the handbag represents a cosmological concept so fundamental, so universally accessible through observation of the natural world and contemplation of basic geometric forms that its repeated appearance across cultures reflects not contact, but rather the independent discovery of the same underlying truth about the structure of reality. In Scranton's analysis, the rectangular base of the handbag represents the earth, associated across cultures with the symbolism of the square, the stable, the material, the manifest, while the curved handle represents the dome of the sky, the vault of heaven, the celestial sphere that arches over the terrestrial plane and contains the stars, the sun, the moon, and the cosmic forces that govern existence. The handbag, in this reading, is not a container at all, but a cosmogram, a symbolic representation of the universe itself, depicting the union of heaven and earth, spirit and matter, the above and the below in a single, portable image that could be carried by divine intermediaries as a badge of their cosmic authority. Their mastery of the fundamental structure of reality, their role as bridges between the terrestrial and celestial realms. If Scranton's interpretation is correct, and it must be acknowledged that his work, like Hancock's, falls outside the boundaries of mainstream academic acceptability, then the three handbags at the top of the vulture stone at Göbekli Tepe take on an entirely new significance, transforming from mysterious decorative elements into a framing device that establishes the cosmological context for everything depicted below. This pillar, the shapes seem to say, represents the universe. The images carved upon it depict events and processes of cosmic significance. What you are about to see is not merely local mythology, but universal truth encoded in stone by people who understood the structure of reality at a level we have only begun to suspect. The vultures become not merely birds of prey or psychopomps for individual souls, but agents of cosmic transformation. The scorpion becomes not merely a dangerous creature, but a guardian of thresholds between realms. The headless man becomes not merely a corpse or a sacrificial victim, but humanity itself, suspended between earth and sky, between matter and spirit, between death and rebirth, awaiting transformation through processes that the builders of Göbekli Tepe encoded in symbols we have forgotten how to read. But if the handbags remain the most debated of Göbekli Tepe's symbols due to their apparent cross-cultural resonances, the most frequently carved animal at the site, and therefore, presumably, the most symbolically important to the community that built and maintained the temple complex, is one that has received comparatively little attention in popular discussions, perhaps because it lacks the dramatic implications of comet impacts and lost civilizations. The fox, that humble, cunning, liminal creature that appears again and again across multiple enclosures, carved onto pillars in positions of obvious prominence, depicted as belt ornaments and ceremonial garments, and found in skeletal form throughout the site, in quantities that far exceed what dietary necessity or random chance could explain. The fox was clearly not a primary food source for the Göbekli Tepe community. Gazelle bones dominate the faunal assemblage, indicating that these swift herbivores formed the staple protein, yet fox remains appear in numbers rivaling sheep and goat, and the frequency with which foxes appear in the carved imagery corresponds almost exactly to their presence in the archaeological record, as if the builders were maintaining a deliberate parallel between the animals they depicted and the animals they somehow incorporated into their ritual practices. What did the fox mean to these ancient people? And why did they elevate this particular creature to such symbolic prominence in a menagerie that included far more impressive beasts? Lions, bulls, vultures, serpents. that would seem to carry greater mythological weight. One theory, advanced by Sweatman and others who favor astronomical interpretations of the Göbekli Tepe imagery, proposes that the fox represented a specific constellation or asterism in the ancient sky, perhaps corresponding to what we now call Aquarius or some portion thereof, and that its frequent appearance reflected the importance of that celestial region in the astronomical observations and calendrical calculations that may have been central to the site's function. Another theory, grounded more firmly in comparative ethnography and the analysis of fox symbolism across cultures, notes that foxes are almost universally associated with liminality, with boundaries, with the capacity to move between worlds, between civilization and wilderness, between day and night, between the seen and the unseen, and suggests that the fox at Göbekli Tepe served as a kind of shamanic familiar, a spirit guide that could accompany human souls on their journeys between realms, a mediator between the community and the supernatural forces they sought to propitiate. On the central pillar of Enclosure D, one of the two great megaliths that stand at the heart of the circular structure, clearly representing figures of supreme importance in the symbolic hierarchy of the site, a fox is depicted hanging from the belt of an otherwise anthropomorphic figure, positioned precisely where a hunter might hang a trophy or a priest might wear a ritual garment, suggesting that the fox was not merely a symbol to be contemplated, but an identity to be worn, assumed, incorporated into the self through the donning of its pelt, or the invocation of its spirit. Other pillars show foxes in dynamic poses, leaping through carved porthole stones, running in pairs, interacting with other creatures in ways that suggest narrative rather than mere decoration, as if the ancient artists were telling stories about foxes, recording their mythological adventures, or prescribing ritual actions that involved the fox as a central participant in ceremonies whose content we can only dimly imagine. The fox bones found throughout the site raise additional questions that mainstream archaeology has been reluctant to pursue. Were these foxes hunted for their pelts, killed for their symbolic value, or actually raised in some form of proto-domestication that would make them among the earliest animals to be brought under human control? Not for food, not for labor, but for spiritual purposes, for their role as mediators between worlds, for the power they were believed to confer upon those who possessed them. The evidence is fragmentary, the interpretations speculative, and no consensus exists among the researchers who have examined the question. But the sheer volume of fox material at Göbekli Tepe suggests that whatever relationship existed between this community and this creature, it was far more complex, far more deliberate, and far more central to their religious life than the occasional hunting of a clever pest would indicate. And so we find ourselves surrounded by symbols, handbags that might be cosmograms, foxes that might be shamanic guides, vultures that might be soul carriers or constellation markers, scorpions that might guard the entrance to the underworld, none of which have been definitively decoded despite 3 decades of excavation and research, all of which point toward a symbolic system of extraordinary sophistication maintained across 1,500 years by people we were taught to consider primitive hunter-gatherers, incapable of sustained religious thought. The symbols are there, carved into stone, preserved by deliberate burial. For 11,000 years, waiting for someone to finally understand what they mean and why, the people of Göbekli Tepe considered them important enough to carve, maintain, and ultimately protect from the ravages of time through an act of monumental burial that itself raises questions about intention, foresight, and the possibility that these ancient temple builders knew their work would outlast their civilization and wanted to ensure it survived intact for whoever might eventually come looking. But why did they bury it at all? And what can the act of burial tell us about the end of Göbekli Tepe's active life as a religious center? About the transformation of belief that must have occurred for a community to deliberately entomb the sacred spaces they had maintained for nearly 2 millennia, sealing away their gods, their symbols, their accumulated spiritual infrastructure beneath thousands of tons of rubble, as if the entire complex had somehow become dangerous, obsolete, or so charged with power that it could no longer be safely left exposed to the world above. Imagine dedicating your entire life to building something sacred, something that connected your community to the cosmos, something that your grandparents built and their grandparents before them, a monument so important that your people had gathered from across the region for nearly 2,000 years to maintain it, to carve new pillars for it, to perform rituals within its circular walls that bound the living to the dead and the earth to the sky. And then imagine making the decision to destroy it, not through violence or neglect, but through deliberate, systematic burial, filling those sacred spaces with thousands of tons of rubble, bones, and broken tools until nothing remained visible. Until the temple that had defined your spiritual existence for 80 generations vanished beneath an artificial hill, sealed away from sunlight and human eyes as if it had never existed at all. This is what happened at Göbekli Tepe sometime around 8000 BCE. And the question of why a community would kill its own temple, why they would expend the enormous labor required to bury what they had expended even more enormous labor to build, remains one of the most haunting and least satisfactorily answered mysteries surrounding this already mysterious site. For many years, the dominant interpretation held that the burial was entirely intentional, a ritual act of decommissioning that reflected deliberate spiritual choice rather than abandonment or catastrophe. And Klaus Schmidt, the archaeologist who devoted 2 decades of his life to excavating Göbekli Tepe before his death in 2014, was the primary advocate of this view, arguing that the backfilling of the enclosures represented a programmatic effort to close sacred spaces that had completed their spiritual function, or that needed to be sealed away for reasons rooted in beliefs we can no longer access. Schmidt pointed to parallel practices documented elsewhere in the ancient world, the Olmec colossal heads of Mesoamerica, that were deliberately defaced and buried, apparently to neutralize their power, the Neolithic houses of Çatalhöyük that were periodically filled in and built over, creating artificial tells that grew taller with each generation, the widespread Near Eastern tradition of ritually killing temples before abandoning them, breaking sacred objects and sealing doorways to prevent desecration by future occupants who might not understand or respect the powers that dwelt within, and suggested that Göbekli Tepe's burial fit within this broader pattern of deliberate architectural death, a kind of funeral for buildings that were understood to possess spiritual life, and that therefore required appropriate end-of-life rituals when their time had come. This interpretation had the virtue of treating the builders of Göbekli Tepe as rational agents, making meaningful choices within their own cultural framework rather than as victims of circumstance or passive observers of natural processes beyond their control. And it aligned with the broader scholarly understanding of the site as a primarily religious complex, where spiritual considerations would have taken precedence over practical ones in determining how the space was used and ultimately how it was closed. The backfill material itself seemed to support this reading. Far from being random debris washed in by erosion or collapsed from natural causes, the fill contained a carefully curated mixture of limestone rubble, animal bones from what appeared to be ritual feasting, broken tools and stone vessels, and, most intriguingly, fragments of human skulls that showed evidence of deliberate modification, including carved grooves and drilled holes that suggested the skulls had been displayed, perhaps hung from cords, before being incorporated into the material used to bury the enclosures. Whatever was happening at Göbekli Tepe in its final phase, it clearly involved human remains, ritual killing of animals, and the systematic dismantling and interment of sacred architecture in ways that pointed toward intentional ceremonial closure rather than accidental destruction. But recent research has complicated this tidy narrative in ways that the archaeological team has been somewhat reluctant to publicize. Perhaps because the new interpretation is less dramatic, less spiritually resonant, and less useful for generating the kind of public interest and funding that major excavation projects require to sustain themselves over decades of painstaking work. Lee Clare, the archaeologist who has led the Göbekli Tepe excavation since Schmidt's death, has increasingly emphasized evidence suggesting that at least some of the burial was accidental, the result of massive landslides that swept down from the domestic structures built on the slopes above the ceremonial enclosures, inundating the sacred spaces with debris from collapsed houses, eroded sediments, and the accumulated refuse of daily life that had built up over centuries of continuous occupation. The enclosures in this revised understanding were not ceremonially closed, but catastrophically destroyed, overwhelmed by slope failures that the community attempted to repair and contain through the construction of terrace walls and stabilization works, but that ultimately proved impossible to manage, forcing the abandonment of damaged structures and the eventual burial of the entire site under the weight of its own accumulated history. The evidence for this interpretation comes from careful stratigraphic analysis of the fill deposits, which reveals patterns of inundation consistent with rapid, uncontrolled slope movement, rather than the gradual, deliberate backfilling that Schmidt's ritual closure theory would predict. And from the discovery of repair work and structural modifications that only make sense if the enclosures were being actively maintained against ongoing damage rather than ceremonially decommissioned, according to a predetermined plan. Enclosure D, the home of the famous vulture stone, shows clear evidence of at least one major landslide event that caused severe damage to the structure and prompted extensive repairs before a second catastrophic inundation apparently led to its final abandonment, suggesting that the community fought to preserve their sacred space against natural forces before ultimately accepting that the battle was lost and allowing the hill to claim what the hill was determined to take. And yet, even this revised, less romantic interpretation raises profound questions about the relationship between the Göbekli Tepe community and their temple. Because whether the burial was intentional or accidental, deliberate or catastrophic, the fact remains that these people chose not to excavate their sacred spaces after they were inundated, chose not to dig out the pillars and restore the enclosures to their former glory, chose to let the earth swallow what they had spent nearly 2 millennia creating and maintaining. This choice, if it was a choice, represents a rupture in the continuity of belief that demands explanation, because communities do not simply abandon their gods without reason, do not walk away from sacred sites that had structured their spiritual lives for 80 generations without some fundamental transformation in how they understood themselves, their world, and the powers that governed both. The most compelling explanation for this transformation lies not in the geology of slope failure or the archaeology of backfill deposits, but in the broader historical context of the period, because the centuries surrounding Göbekli Tepe's abandonment witnessed one of the most profound revolutions in human history: the transition from hunting and gathering to agriculture, from nomadic existence to settled village life, from a spirituality rooted in the wild landscape and its dangerous creatures to a spirituality rooted in the domesticated field and its cyclical rhythms of planting and harvest. Around 8000 BCE, the very period when Göbekli Tepe was being buried, communities throughout the Fertile Crescent were experimenting with the cultivation of wild grains, the domestication of sheep and goats, and the establishment of permanent settlements that would eventually give rise to the great civilizations of Mesopotamia, Egypt, and beyond. And this transformation was not merely economic or technological, but profoundly ideological, requiring new gods, new rituals, new sacred spaces appropriate to a way of life that bore little resemblance to the nomadic existence that had preceded it. The vultures that soared above Göbekli Tepe, carrying the souls of the dead to their celestial home, belonged to a world of open skies and endless horizons, a world where humans moved through the landscape like the animals they hunted, following the migrations of game and the seasonal availability of wild foods, owning nothing that could not be carried on their backs, and answering to no authority beyond the spirits of the wilderness that surrounded them. The foxes that crept through the carved porthole stones and hung from the belts of anthropomorphic pillars were creatures of boundaries, liminal beings that moved between the human world and the wild, and their symbolic prominence reflected a spirituality in which the boundary between civilization and nature was permeable, fluid, constantly negotiated through ritual and offering, and the wearing of animal power as ceremonial garment. But farmers need different gods. Gods of rain and sunshine, gods who ensure the fertility of fields and the health of livestock. Gods whose primary concern is not the journey of souls to distant star realms, but the immediate, practical matter of making seeds sprout and animals breed, and the harvest come in before the rains turn to frost. Farmers need temples in their villages, not on remote mountaintops requiring pilgrimages. They need rituals tied to the agricultural calendar, not to the migrations of wild game. They need priests who understand the mysteries of cultivation, not shamans who wear fox pelts and commune with vultures. The spirituality of Göbekli Tepe was the spirituality of the hunt, and as the hunt gave way to the plough, the old sacred sites became not merely obsolete but potentially dangerous, repositories of power associated with a way of life that the new agricultural communities were actively trying to leave behind. Doorways to a wild world that settled farmers needed to close if they were to commit fully to the demanding, all-consuming project of making the earth yield its bounty through human labor rather than divine provision. Perhaps this is why Göbekli Tepe was buried rather than simply abandoned, because abandonment would have left the old power accessible, the old doorways open, the old gods waiting for anyone foolish or nostalgic enough to seek them out, while burial sealed those powers away, neutralized those doorways, entombed those gods beneath a weight of earth and stone that announced, with the finality only architecture can achieve, that this chapter of the human story was finished, and that whoever came after would need to find their own gods, build their own temples, carve their own symbols appropriate to the world they were creating, rather than the world they had left behind. And here, perhaps, is the deepest irony of Göbekli Tepe's burial. The very act of destruction that ended the site's active life as a religious center is precisely what preserved it for discovery 11,000 years later. Because had the enclosures been left exposed to the elements, had the carved pillars stood in open air through 12 millennia of wind and rain and freeze-thaw cycles and human scavenging for building materials, nothing would remain today except scattered limestone fragments stripped of their carvings and archaeological significance, indistinguishable from the natural bedrock of the Turkish hills. The burial that killed Göbekli Tepe also saved it, creating a time capsule of unprecedented preservation that allowed Klaus Schmidt to kneel in the dust of that barren hilltop in 1994 and recognize, in the carved fragments that farmers had been discarding for generations, the traces of something that would rewrite the history of human civilization. Some have suggested, Graham Hancock most prominently among them, that this preservation was intentional, that the builders of Göbekli Tepe knew their world was ending and deliberately buried their temple to protect it for a future generation that might understand its significance and learn from its symbols, a message in a bottle cast, not across oceans but across time, waiting 11,000 years for someone to pull it from the earth and decode its contents. This is almost certainly projection, the romantic attribution of modern, preservationist sensibilities to ancient peoples who had no concept of archaeology, no framework for imagining that their descendants would forget what they knew and need to rediscover it through excavation and interpretation. No reason to believe that anything they buried would ever be found again by anyone capable of understanding what they were looking at. And yet the burial was so thorough, so complete, so far beyond what slope failure alone could explain, that the question lingers: did they know, somehow, that they were creating something that would outlast not only their lives, but their entire civilization, their entire way of understanding the world, their entire species as it existed in that moment of transition between the ice and the warmth, between the hunt and the harvest, between the old gods and the new? We will never know what they intended, but we know what they achieved. A monument that survived, a symbolic system that persists, and a mystery that deepens with every season of excavation as we realize that what we have uncovered represents only a fraction of what remains buried beneath the Potbelly Hill, waiting, perhaps, for a future generation with better tools, better questions, and the willingness to consider answers that the current generation of scholars has refused to entertain. After 30 years of excavation, after thousands of academic papers and dozens of documentaries and countless hours of conference presentations, after the expenditure of millions of dollars in research funding and the dedication of entire careers to understanding this single site on a barren hilltop in southeastern Turkey, we arrive at a question so fundamental that its persistence seems almost embarrassing. What do the symbols at Göbekli Tepe actually mean, and why, despite all our sophisticated tools and trained specialists and institutional resources, have we failed to decode them in any definitive way that commands consensus among the scholars who have devoted their lives to studying them? The carvings are there, preserved with remarkable clarity by the very burial that ended the site's active life, displaying an iconographic system so elaborate and so consistently maintained across 1,500 years of continuous use that it clearly communicated specific, important, transmissible meanings to the people who created and contemplated it. And yet, when you ask the world's leading experts what the vultures signify, what message the foxes convey, what cosmological narrative is being enacted across these 12,000-year-old surfaces, the answer you receive is some variation of a shrug, a gesture of scholarly humility that has calcified over 3 decades into something that looks less like caution and more like avoidance, less like intellectual honesty, and more like institutional paralysis in the face of evidence that refuses to conform to existing paradigms. The standard justification for this interpretive impasse is methodological, without written texts that explain the symbols, without oral traditions that survive from this period to bridge the gap between their visual vocabulary and our linguistic understanding, without a Rosetta Stone that might allow us to translate their images into our words. Any interpretation we propose must remain speculative, unprovable, and therefore scientifically irresponsible to assert with confidence. This is a reasonable position, one that reflects the genuine epistemological challenges of studying prehistoric societies that left no written records, and it would be unfair to dismiss it as mere intellectual cowardice or professional self-protection. The scholars who work at Göbekli Tepe are serious researchers who have devoted years of painstaking effort to documenting, preserving, and analyzing one of the most important archaeological discoveries in human history, and their reluctance to make claims they cannot support reflects the training they received and the standards their discipline demands. But methodological caution becomes something else entirely when it functions not as a temporary acknowledgement of incomplete evidence, but as a permanent excuse for interpretive paralysis when we don't know, transforms from an honest admission of current limitations into a mantra that forecloses investigation, when the absence of definitive proof is wielded not as a spur to further research, but as a shield against any interpretation that might challenge comfortable assumptions about what prehistoric peoples were capable of knowing, believing, and communicating through their art. Consider the H-shaped symbols that appear repeatedly throughout Göbekli Tepe. Two vertical lines connected by a horizontal bar, rendered with variations in proportion and positioning, but maintaining a consistent basic form that suggests intentional standardization rather than random decoration. Martin Sweatman, the Edinburgh engineer whose astronomical interpretations have so irritated the mainstream archaeological community, has proposed that these H symbols represent the positions of bright stars like Vega and Deneb, former pole stars that would have held cosmological significance for ancient observers tracking the slow wobble of Earth's axis across millennia. And while his theory is speculative, as all theories about these symbols must necessarily be, it at least attempts to engage with the evidence, to propose a testable hypothesis that could be refined or refuted through further analysis of stellar positions, pillar orientations, and the broader astronomical context of the site. The official interpretation, by contrast, is that the H symbols are abstract decorative elements, whose specific meaning cannot be determined. An interpretation that is technically unfalsifiable, scientifically uninformative, and functionally equivalent to admitting that mainstream archaeology has given up trying to understand what these people were attempting to communicate. Or consider the nested V-shaped marks that cover portions of Pillar 43 and appear elsewhere throughout the site. Marks that Sweatman has interpreted as representing individual days in a lunar-solar calendar system, with the total count yielding 365 marks that correspond to a solar year composed of 12 lunar months plus 11 epagomenal days. A calendar so sophisticated that if Sweatman's reading is correct, it would predate the next earliest known example by thousands of years, and demonstrate that Stone Age peoples possessed astronomical and mathematical knowledge we have consistently denied them in our models of gradual cognitive and cultural development. The excavation team has responded to this claim with skepticism, verging on dismissal, noting that the V marks might simply be decorative scoring, that their count is subject to interpretation depending on how one defines the boundaries of individual marks, and that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence that Sweatman has not provided, all of which is fair as far as it goes, but none of which constitutes an alternative interpretation that better explains why these marks exist, why they were carved with such apparent care, why they appear in contexts that seem to demand symbolic, rather than merely aesthetic significance. The pattern repeats across every major symbol category at Göbekli Tepe. Outsiders propose interpretations that are speculative but at least substantive. Mainstream archaeologists respond with methodological objections that are legitimate but ultimately evasive, and the symbols themselves remain officially undecoded, their meanings relegated to the comfortable limbo of unknown, where they threaten no established paradigms and require no revision of textbooks already written, curricula already established, careers already built on the assumption that prehistoric hunter-gatherers could not possibly have possessed the sophisticated astronomical knowledge, the organized religious hierarchies, or the long-term cultural continuity that the symbols seem to suggest. This is not a conspiracy. There are no secret meetings where archaeologists agree to suppress inconvenient truths about human prehistory. But it is a system, a set of institutional incentives and professional norms that consistently favor caution over speculation, that reward scholars who stay within established boundaries and punish those who venture beyond them, that treats the absence of proof as equivalent to proof of absence, and thereby closes down interpretive possibilities before they can be seriously explored. The question worth asking is why this particular site generates such intense institutional resistance to interpretation. And the answer, uncomfortable as it may be to acknowledge, is that Göbekli Tepe threatens too many foundational assumptions to be safely decoded without consequence for the decipherers. If the vulture stone is genuinely a date stamp recording a comet impact around 10,950 BCE, then hunter-gatherers possessed astronomical knowledge sophisticated enough to track precession, identify constellations, and calculate dates thousands of years into the past or future. Capabilities that our models of cognitive evolution do not allow for populations at this stage of development. Capabilities that would require us to fundamentally reconsider what we mean by primitive and advanced when describing human societies. If the handbag symbols genuinely connect Göbekli Tepe to Assyrian palace reliefs and Olmec monuments and Maori mythology, then some form of cultural transmission, whether through direct contact, shared inheritance from earlier sources, or access to universal truths about cosmic structure, linked civilizations we have confidently declared independent, forcing us to redraw the maps of human migration and cultural influence that anchor our understanding of how the modern world came to be. If the foxes represent astronomical markers, or shamanic guides, or totemic ancestors whose significance persisted across 80 generations of temple builders, then we must accept that prehistoric religion was not the crude animism of frightened savages projecting spirits onto natural phenomena they could not understand, but a sophisticated symbolic system capable of encoding and transmitting complex information across centuries without the aid of writing. A system that in some ways exceeded our own capacity for cultural memory, given how quickly we forget the meanings of symbols created by our own grandparents. Each of these implications, taken seriously, would require not minor adjustments to existing frameworks, but wholesale revision of foundational assumptions about human cognitive evolution, cultural development, and the relationship between religion, astronomy, and civilization that has structured archaeological thinking since the discipline emerged in the 19th century. Lee Clare, the current head of the Göbekli Tepe excavation, has pushed back against critics who accuse his team of deliberately slow-walking research to maintain the mystery and keep tourist interest alive, noting with evident frustration that archaeology is inherently slow, that rushing excavation destroys the very evidence researchers are trying to preserve, and that every layer of soil removed is a layer of information lost forever to future scientists who might possess better tools and ask better questions. Why would I be so selfish as to dig the entire site and take these possibilities away from future generations of archaeologists? Clare has asked. And the question is not rhetorical. It reflects a genuine ethical commitment to stewardship over exploitation, to leaving something for those who come after, rather than extracting everything for those who happen to be present now. This is admirable, and it is also convenient, because as long as 90% of Göbekli Tepe remains unexcavated, any interpretation can be deflected with the observation that we simply don't have enough evidence yet, that the answers might lie in enclosures not yet opened, in pillars not yet exposed, in symbols not yet documented, always just beyond the current horizon of knowledge, always receding as we approach. But the symbols we have already uncovered are not silent. They speak, if we are willing to listen, in a language that may be difficult, but is not necessarily impossible to learn. The vulture holds the circle in its wing across 12,000 years, asking us to decide whether we are looking at the sun in Sagittarius, or the soul of a decapitated man, or something else entirely that encompasses both astronomical and spiritual meanings, in a synthesis our post-Enlightenment minds struggle to conceive. The foxes leap and crouch and hang from belts, inviting us to consider what power these liminal creatures held for people who lived at the boundary between the Ice Age and the warming world, between the hunt and the harvest, between the old gods and the new. The handbags float above scenes of cosmic significance, challenging us to explain their presence through coincidence or convergence or connection. To choose between explanations that preserve our comfortable assumptions and explanations that might require us to start over. To admit that we have been wrong about the capabilities of our ancestors, and therefore wrong about the trajectory that led from them to us. Göbekli Tepe does not care about academic politics, about tenure decisions, about the peer review process, about which interpretations are considered respectable and which are relegated to the fringe. It sits in the Turkish hills as it has sat for 11,000 years, mostly still buried, mostly still unexcavated, mostly still undecoded, waiting with the patience of stone for someone to finally ask the right questions, with the willingness to accept whatever answers emerge. Even if those answers require us to rewrite textbooks, revise paradigms, and acknowledge that the people who carved these symbols knew something we have forgotten, preserved something we have lost, and spoke across millennia in a language we have not yet learned to hear, because we have not yet decided that learning it is worth the cost of everything we would have to unlearn first. The symbols are there, carved in limestone, preserved by burial, exposed by excavation, documented by photography, published in journals, and waiting, still waiting after 30 years, for someone to say what they mean. The question is not whether we can decode them. The question is whether we are willing to accept what they might be trying to tell us about who we were, how we became what we are, and what we might have known once, before we forgot. 11,000 years ago, someone carved a vulture holding a circle on a pillar in southeastern Turkey, and we still don't know why. Or perhaps we do know, and are simply afraid to say it out loud.